The Ghost Light. Off the rugged coast of Maine stood the Blackrock Lighthouse, a solitary sentinel perched on jagged cliffs overlooking a restless sea. For nearly a century, the lighthouse had guided ships away from treacherous rocks and crashing waves. But it had also been the source of whispers and warnings, for Blackrock was said to be cursed. Locals claimed the light sometimes flickered, even on calm nights, as if it struggled against something unseen. Sailors told of hearing strange, mournful cries carried by the wind, and of shadowy figures glimpsed through the mist. Some believed it was haunted by the spirits of shipwreck victims, while others spoke of the final keeper, a man named Arthur Kellen, who vanished one stormy night without a trace. For decades, the lighthouse stood abandoned, its beams extinguished, its walls battered by the elements. Until now. Margaret Maggie Turner was a freelance journalist specializing in the paranormal. Her blog, Spectre Chronicles, had gained a small but loyal following, thanks to her knack for blending skepticism with a genuine curiosity for the unknown. When she heard about Blackrock Lighthouse, she knew she had found her next story. Maggie stood on the rocky shore, staring up at the towering structure. Its black and white striped walls were weathered, streaked with salt and moss. The lantern room at the top was dark, its glass cracked and stained. "This place is a fixer-upper's nightmare," said Ryan, her cameraman and friend. He adjusted his equipment, squinting at the lighthouse through the fog. "That's what makes it perfect," Maggie replied, her voice tinged with excitement. She pulled out her notebook, jotting down observations. An isolated location, a tragic history, and plenty of ghost stories. What more could we ask for? A hotel instead of a damp lighthouse? Ryan quipped. Maggie grinned. "Come on. Where's your sense of adventure?" Their guide, an older man named Joe, cleared his throat. "You sure you want to stay here overnight?" he asked, his tone serious. "That's the plan," Maggie said, glancing at him. Joe shook his head. "You'll be the first to do so in over 50 years. Folks around here don't go near Blackrock after dark." "Why not?" Ryan asked, his curiosity piqued. Joe hesitated. "Strange things happen here. Lights in the windows when there shouldn't be. Voices in the wind. And sometimes, people hear the bell." "The bell?" Maggie asked, intrigued. "The fog bell," Joe explained. "It hasn't worked in decades, but some say they still hear it ringing, especially on stormy nights." Maggie exchanged a glance with Ryan, her excitement growing. "Perfect. Let's get started." Inside the lighthouse, the air was damp and cold. Dust coated every surface, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Maggie and Ryan set up their equipment in the keeper's quarters, a small room with peeling wallpaper and a single iron bed. "This is cozy," Ryan said, setting down his camera bag. "Rustic," Maggie corrected, snapping photos of the room. They explored the lighthouse, documenting every creak and shadow. The spiral staircase leading to the lantern room groaned under their weight, and the narrow windows offered glimpses of the churning sea below. "It's amazing how much history is still here," Maggie said, running her fingers over an old logbook left behind by one of the keepers. Ryan nodded, though he seemed uneasy. "Yeah, but it's creepy as hell. Feels like someone's watching us." Maggie laughed. "That's just your imagination. Or maybe the ghosts are curious." By the time they returned to the keeper's quarters, the sun was setting, casting the room in an eerie orange glow. Maggie set up a digital recorder on the table, while Ryan positioned a camera facing the door. "Ready for the night shift?" Maggie asked. Ryan sighed. "As ready as I'll ever be." The first few hours passed quietly, with nothing but the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs and the occasional whistle of wind through the cracks in the walls. Maggie and Ryan took turns monitoring the equipment, but the excitement of the day soon gave way to fatigue. Around midnight, Maggie dozed off in a chair while Ryan reviewed the footage from earlier. He was halfway through a recording of their arrival when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like the tolling of a bell. He froze, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, echoing through the room. "Maggie," he whispered, shaking her shoulder. She stirred, groaning. "What is it?" "Listen," Ryan said. The bell tolled again, deep and mournful. Maggie sat up, her eyes wide. Is that? The fog bell, Ryan said, his voice trembling. Maggie grabbed her recorder and pressed the record button. Is someone there? She called out. For a moment there was silence. Then, a faint whisper seemed to drift through the air, too quiet to make out. What was that? Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Maggie said, her pulse racing. The bell rang again, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the spiral staircase. They turned toward the door, the creaking of the stairs growing louder. Maggie grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at the staircase, but the beam revealed nothing. Hello? She called, her voice trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the howling wind outside. Then, a voice, low and gravelly, spoke from the darkness. Leave this place. Ryan nearly dropped his camera. Did you hear that? Maggie nodded, her grip on the flashlight tightening. Who are you? She asked. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the bell rang again, louder this time, followed by the sound of a door slamming somewhere above them. Maggie and Ryan exchanged a glance, their curiosity battling with fear. We have to go upstairs, Maggie said. Ryan stared at her like she was insane. Are you serious? Something just told us to leave. That's exactly why we need to go, Maggie insisted. If we leave now, we'll never know what's really happening here. Reluctantly, Ryan followed her up the staircase, the old wood groaning beneath their feet. As they ascended the narrow, spiraling staircase, the air grew colder. The smell of salt water and mildew became stronger with each step, and the creaking of the old lighthouse seemed to grow more pronounced. Maggie's flashlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Ryan, still uneasy, whispered, Maggie, I don't know about this. I'm seriously getting bad vibes. Maggie didn't respond at first. She was too focused on the eerie silence surrounding them. The footsteps they had heard earlier had ceased, and the bell, which had been tolling incessantly, was now silent. But the oppressive feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. Finally, they reached the top of the staircase, where the lantern room awaited them. The door was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. Maggie pushed it open slowly, her heart pounding with both excitement and dread. The lantern room was filled with dust. The glass panels of the old lamp cracked and covered with grime. But what caught Maggie's attention wasn't the room's neglected condition. It was the presence of something that hadn't been there when they first explored the lighthouse earlier that evening. A figure stood in the center of the room, its back to them. The figure was tall and thin, draped in a weathered, dark coat. Its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and in its hand, it held a lantern, the source of the dim, flickering light that illuminated the room. Who are you? Maggie's voice trembled as she stepped forward. The figure didn't move, but the lantern's light grew brighter, casting long shadows on the walls. The air around them grew heavy, the temperature dropping even further. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them, and the room seemed to close in. The figure finally turned, its face still hidden in shadow. But as it moved, something strange happened. The air itself seemed to bend around the figure, distorting it as if it were a mirage. Maggie, what the hell is going on? Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure's voice was low and cold, as if it were speaking from a great distance. Leave now, or you will never leave. Maggie stood frozen, staring at the figure. She could feel the weight of its presence, the palpable sense of doom that seemed to fill the room. But she wasn't ready to leave yet. She needed to understand what was happening. Why are you here? She asked, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. The figure raised its lantern, and the flame within it flickered, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. For a moment, the shadows seemed to move, twisting and shifting, as though they were alive. The temperature dropped even further, and Maggie's breath came out in visible clouds. Arthur Kellen, the figure whispered, its voice barely a breath. The last keeper, the last one to light the lamp. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "Arthur Kellen?" she repeated. "The one who disappeared?" The figure nodded, its movements slow and deliberate. He lit the lamp. For the last time. The sea took him, as it took many before him. Ryan took a step back, his face pale. "We need to get out of here, Maggie. This isn't just a ghost story, it's real." But Maggie was mesmerized, unable to pull herself away. She had heard the stories about Arthur Kellen, the keeper who was said to have vanished one stormy night, leaving only his lantern behind. But now, standing before this apparition, she understood that the truth was far darker than the legends. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" Maggie whispered. The figure's face slowly became visible, a gaunt, hollow expression staring back at her. His eyes were deep and dark, as if they had seen something beyond the realm of the living. "Because you would not have believed. No one ever believes until it's too late." Suddenly, the room around them seemed to shift. The walls groaned as if the lighthouse itself was alive, its old bones creaking and groaning in protest. The temperature plummeted, and Maggie could see her breath now in the frigid air. The shadows around them seemed to stretch longer, reaching out like ghostly hands. Ryan grabbed Maggie's arm, pulling her toward the door. "Maggie, let's go. Now!" Maggie tried to resist, but the figure's presence held her in place, an invisible force that rooted her to the floor. "You cannot leave," the figure said, his voice rising in a harsh whisper. "The storm has already begun. You're trapped here, like the others before you." Maggie's eyes widened. The wind outside howled, and the sound of crashing waves grew louder, more violent. The bell tolled once again, its sound reverberating through the lighthouse, shaking the very foundation. Before she could react, the lantern's light flickered violently, casting everything into darkness. The world around Maggie and Ryan seemed to collapse into chaos. The floor beneath them shook as the storm outside intensified, its winds howling and crashing against the lighthouse like a monstrous force. The bell tolled louder, the sound vibrating through their bones. "Move, Maggie! Move!" Ryan shouted, but Maggie couldn't hear him. She was too consumed by the storm, by the figure that now seemed to be fading into the darkness. Suddenly, the lantern flared back to life, its light blinding and overwhelming. Maggie shielded her eyes, but as the light grew brighter, she saw the figure again. Closer now, standing right in front of her. And then the storm ceased. The wind stopped, the waves quieted, and the bell's toll faded into an eerie silence. Maggie looked around, disoriented. She found herself back in the lantern room, but the figure was gone. The room was cold and empty. Ryan stood beside her, shaking, his face pale. "Maggie, what just happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling, "but I think we need to leave. Now." They turned and rushed down the staircase, the lighthouse groaning ominously as they fled. The door was still open when they reached the bottom, but when they stepped outside, the storm had vanished as quickly as it had come. The sea was calm, and the moonlight bathed the lighthouse in an eerie glow. But as they walked away from the lighthouse, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that the figure, the ghost of Arthur Kellen, was still watching them from the darkness, and that the bell, no matter how silent, would toll again. Weeks passed since Maggie and Ryan left Blackrock Lighthouse behind, but neither of them could shake the eerie events they had experienced that night. The footage from their cameras was enough to send shivers down their spines. Strange shadows, the faint outlines of a figure in the lantern room, and the chilling sound of the bell ringing in the distance, even though there was no storm. But Maggie's curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She began to dive deeper into the history of Blackrock, searching for clues that might explain what they had encountered. What was it about Arthur Kellen that kept the lighthouse and its curse alive? One afternoon, Maggie returned to the small town near the lighthouse. She had found an old journal, tucked away in the town's archives, belonging to a former lighthouse keeper. It detailed the tragic story of Arthur Kellen and the mystery surrounding his disappearance. According to the journal, Kellen had been obsessed with keeping the light burning no matter the cost. The The journal described his descent into madness as he became increasingly isolated, convinced that the lighthouse itself was alive. As Maggie walked into the local cafe, she found the atmosphere unusually quiet. The few townspeople inside gave her cautious, sidelong glances, as if they knew something she didn't. Joe, the guide who had taken her to the lighthouse, sat at a corner table nursing a cup of coffee. His face looked older now, more worn, as though the weight of the place had aged him prematurely. She walked over to him, her heart racing. "Joe, I need to ask you something. You never told me the full story about Arthur Kellen. What really happened to him?" Joe's eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a tight line. He didn't answer right away, instead taking a long sip from his mug. Finally, he sighed. "You don't get it, do you?" he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "The lighthouse doesn't just keep the ship safe. Keep something else locked inside. And Arthur Kellen, he was part of that." Maggie sat down across from him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Joe hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. Arthur Kellen was the last of a long line of keepers, but he didn't just watch the light, he protected it. He made sure no one tampered with the flame, because he knew what would happen if the light ever went out. And when it did, the curse would be free. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. "The curse? What curse?" Joe leaned in, his voice low. "The light was never meant to shine for ships alone. It was a seal, a trap. The lighthouse was built on land where something ancient was buried, something that had been sealed away for centuries. The keepers weren't just there to guide sailors. They were there to keep the darkness contained. And when Arthur Kellen, when he tried to leave, when he became desperate to be free of it all, the darkness took him." Maggie's mind raced. So, the lighthouse keeper, he wasn't just haunted by ghosts. He was fighting something much worse. Joe nodded. "He failed, and that failure is why we all pay the price. Every time someone enters the lighthouse, the curse grows stronger." Maggie couldn't sleep that night. The weight of Joe's words haunted her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. She returned to the inn where she was staying, but every creak of the building, every gust of wind rattling the windows, only deepened the sense of dread that was taking hold of her. She had to go back to Blackrock. There was more to the story. She knew it. She had to see for herself what lay within the lighthouse, what had been hidden for so long. The next morning, she set out alone, leaving a note for Ryan explaining her decision. He had begged her not to go back, but Maggie couldn't ignore the pull of the lighthouse, not after everything she had learned. She drove through the fog-laden roads until the towering silhouette of the lighthouse loomed ahead. The air was thick with tension, and the sea beyond seemed more volatile than ever, waves crashing violently against the rocks below. Maggie stood at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at the structure with a mixture of fear and determination. The door creaked open as if expecting her. She stepped inside, her flashlight casting long shadows across the dusty floor. The interior felt different this time, heavier, almost alive. The walls seemed to close in around her as she ascended the staircase, each step creaking underfoot. When she reached the lantern room, the air grew colder, and she could hear the faint sound of the bell tolling once more. Maggie's hand shook as she pushed open the door to the lantern room. The figure of Arthur Kellen stood before her again, his back turned, holding the lantern. The room seemed darker this time, the shadows stretching unnaturally, as though they were alive. "You came back," the figure said in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. It was the voice of Kellen, but there was something distorted about it, as though it was coming from a place beyond death. "I had to," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "I need to understand. What happened to you?" The figure slowly turned, and for the first time, Maggie saw his face clearly. It was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, two empty sockets that seemed to stare right through her. "I kept the light burning to protect the world from what's buried beneath," Kellen whispered. "But it's too late now. The darkness is free." Maggie's breath caught in her throat as the lantern's flame flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The air grew thick with the sound of whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You have to stop it," Kellen rasped. "It's coming. And when it does, there will be no escape." Maggie stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do I have to do?" Kellen's form began to flicker, his body dissolving into shadow. "The light. You must reignite it, or everything will be lost." The lantern flared, and Maggie instinctively reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. But before she could grab it, a deafening roar filled the air, followed by the sound of the bell tolling louder than ever. The lighthouse shook violently, and Maggie felt herself being pulled toward the open window. The sea below churned with unnatural fury, the waves crashing higher than ever before. And then, everything went black. When Maggie awoke, she found herself lying on the rocky shore, the lighthouse looming behind her. The bell's toll had stopped, and the storm had dissipated. The air was still, the sea calm, but something had changed. The lighthouse, once a place of dread, now seemed at peace. The lantern room above was lit again, its beam shining across the ocean. Maggie stood up, looking back at the lighthouse one last time. She knew the curse had been broken, or at least contained, but the price had been paid. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by the spirits of those who had kept the lighthouse for so long, and by the figure of Arthur Kellen, who had finally found rest. And somewhere in the distance, the faintest toll of the bell echoed once more. Weeks passed since Maggie's encounter with the Blackrock Lighthouse, but the story she uncovered still haunted her. She had returned to her apartment, trying to get back to her normal life, but the memory of Arthur Kellen, the lighthouse, and the curse that had been tied to it was ever present in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the flickering lantern and hear the ghostly toll of the bell. Maggie had published the article about the lighthouse on her blog, detailing everything she had experienced, including the chilling tale of Arthur Kellen. The story gained a considerable amount of attention, and her following grew even larger as people became fascinated by the legend of the Blackrock Lighthouse. Yet, despite the accolades, Maggie couldn't help but feel that something was still unresolved. She tried to move on, but deep down, Maggie knew that the lighthouse wasn't truly done with her. She had barely scratched the surface of the dark history that clung to the place, and there were still unanswered questions. But now, the question she couldn't escape was, what would happen if someone else went to the lighthouse? Months after Maggie's visit, the town near Blackrock Lighthouse saw a curious development. A new keeper was hired to manage the lighthouse. Someone who wasn't local, someone who had no knowledge of the stories and rumors that surrounded it. His name was Daniel Hayes, a young man from Boston who had recently taken up the position, eager to start a new chapter in his life. Maggie first heard about Daniel's arrival through a local newspaper. The headlines were brief, merely announcing the new lighthouse keeper, but something about it made her uneasy. Was he truly unaware of the legends, or had the curse been passed on to him? Her mind raced with questions, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was time for her to return. She hadn't been back since that night, the night when the bell told its last warning. Had the darkness truly been sealed, or had it merely been waiting for the right moment to break free? Determined to find out, Maggie packed her bags and set off for Blackrock once again, this time with a singular purpose: to uncover the full story of what had happened to the lighthouse and its keepers. When Maggie arrived, the town was quieter than it had been before. The wind howled down the narrow streets, and the sea, once calm, now churned with relentless energy. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if something in the atmosphere had shifted. The lighthouse stood as imposing as ever on the cliffs, its black and white stripes now looking more like scars than paint. Maggie felt a sense of dread in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced the night she first stepped inside. She approached the lighthouse with caution, her steps slow as she made her way up the winding path. As she drew closer, she saw a figure standing at the base of the lighthouse, Daniel Hayes, the new keeper. He was looking out over the ocean, seemingly lost in thought, his coat flapping in the wind. Maggie hesitated but then walked up to him. "Excuse me," she called, her voice cutting through the howling wind. Daniel turned, and for the first time Maggie saw his face clearly. He was in his early 30s, with dark hair and a calm demeanor that seemed at odds with the foreboding lighthouse behind him. "Yes?" he asked, offering a polite smile. "I'm Maggie Turner," she introduced herself, holding out a hand. "I'm the journalist who wrote about the Blackrock Lighthouse. I wanted to speak with you about the place, the legends, the history, and the curse." Daniel's smile faltered for a moment, but then he nodded. "I've heard some rumors, but I haven't paid much attention to them. I'm here to keep the light burning, that's all." Maggie took a deep breath, steeling herself. "There's more to it than that. This lighthouse, it's haunted by the ghosts of the keepers who've come before you, and the curse is real. Arthur Kellen, the last keeper, I'm familiar with the stories," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady. "But I don't believe in ghosts or curses. The lighthouse needs a keeper, and I'm here to do my job." Maggie stared at him, a mixture of frustration and concern settling in her chest. "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to warn you. There's something about this place you don't understand. The light isn't just a beacon for ships. It's a trap. It holds something captive, something ancient." Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "I appreciate your concern, but I think I'm capable of handling the lighthouse." Maggie took a step back, unsure of what else to say. Daniel seemed so sure of himself, so convinced that the stories were just myths. But Maggie knew better. She couldn't shake the feeling that history was about to repeat itself, that the darkness that Arthur Kellen had tried to keep contained was just waiting for someone new to unlock it. "I hope you're right," she said softly, before turning and walking away, a weight of dread in her chest. She had warned him, but in her heart, she knew that there was nothing she could do to stop the inevitable. A month passed before Maggie received an unexpected call from the town's mayor. The voice on the other end of the line was grave, and Maggie immediately knew something was wrong. "Miss Turner?" the mayor asked. "I need you to come to Blackrock immediately. It's about Daniel Hayes." Maggie's stomach twisted. What happened to him? "He's gone. Disappeared. No one knows where he is. His things are still at the lighthouse, but he's vanished without a trace. The last anyone saw him, he was up there, near the lantern room." Maggie's heart sank. She had been right all along. The curse hadn't been broken, and now Daniel Hayes had become the latest victim. Without a second thought, Maggie grabbed her keys and drove straight to Blackrock, her mind racing. What had happened to Daniel? Had the darkness finally claimed another soul? And if so, what did it mean for the rest of them? Maggie arrived at the lighthouse late in the evening, her mind still racing with questions. The lighthouse stood in darkness, the light inside unlit. There was a chill in the air, but it wasn't the cold of the sea. It was something more sinister. She stepped inside, calling out, "Daniel? Are you here?" The silence answered her. She slowly made her way up the familiar staircase, the air growing colder with each step. When she reached the lantern room, she felt a sudden shiver run down her spine. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Daniel. He was holding the lantern, his eyes wide and empty. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth moved as if he were speaking, but no sound came out. "Maggie!" "No." Daniel's voice echoed in her mind, a whisper that carried a weight of sorrow. Before she could react, the room grew darker. The air pressed in on her, thick and suffocating, and the figure of Arthur Kellen appeared beside Daniel. His eyes locked on Maggie with a look of hollow sadness. "The curse never ends," Arthur's ghost whispered. "It will claim every keeper, and now it's yours." Maggie stumbled backward, her heart racing as the temperature dropped in the lantern room. She could feel the walls pressing in on her, and the shadows twisted unnaturally around her. Daniel, still holding the lantern, stood motionless, his eyes empty, like a vessel hollowed out by something far more sinister. The bell's toll rang through the silence, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The curse had been waiting all along, patient and relentless, like a storm just waiting for the right moment to strike. She turned to Arthur Kellen's ghost, desperate to understand what had happened. "Why him?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. "Why did it take him? He didn't deserve this." Arthur's transparent form flickered in the dim light. "None of us did," he replied, his voice echoing as if it were carried by 1,000 voices. "The lighthouse is a prison, but the light, it needs a keeper. Always." Maggie's mind spun. The weight of the curse was unbearable. She couldn't let this continue, not again. But what could she do? How could she break something so ancient, so deeply rooted in the fabric of Blackrock's history? The ghost of Arthur seemed to read her thoughts. "You cannot fight the lighthouse. The curse isn't meant to be broken. It was built for a reason." Maggie's hands trembled as she looked at Daniel, still staring vacantly, the lantern's flame flickering as if it were alive. "But I can't leave him like this," she whispered, almost to herself. Arthur's form wavered. "No one can be left untouched by the light. The keepers must stay. Or they must be replaced." Replaced? Maggie felt a sickening realization claw at her chest. She had thought she was simply an observer, someone who could uncover the story, share the truth. But now the truth was that she was trapped in it. Arthur's ghost nodded, his eyes sad but resigned. "The light chooses. It always chooses." Before Maggie could respond, she heard a sound behind her. A slow, deliberate creaking. The door to the lantern room slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking her inside. Panic surged through her veins. She rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Daniel still stood there, holding the lantern, his vacant eyes fixed on her. The bell tolled again, louder this time, shaking the very walls of the lighthouse. "Daniel!" Maggie shouted, her voice desperate. "Please, you have to fight this." But there was no response. No sign of the man he had once been. Maggie turned back to the ghost of Arthur Kellen, her mind racing for a solution. "Tell me what to do. There has to be a way to save him." Arthur's form seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "The light will choose you, just as it chose Daniel." The ground beneath Maggie's feet trembled, and the sound of rushing wind filled the room. The lantern in Daniel's hands began to glow brighter, the light growing more intense until it illuminated the entire room in a blinding blaze. "No!" Maggie screamed, covering her eyes. And then, in the chaos of the moment, everything went dark. When Maggie opened her eyes, she was no longer in the lantern room. She was standing outside the lighthouse, the storm now raging around her, the sea crashing against the jagged rocks below. Her body was cold, numb, as though she had been frozen in place. She staggered to her feet, the wind howling in her ears, and turned to look at the lighthouse. The beam of light was gone. The lighthouse was silent, but something felt different. She could no longer hear the tolling bell. No more whispers or shadows. The air had a strange stillness to it, a calm after the storm. But as she approached the door, she saw something that made her heart stop. A figure stood at the entrance, silhouetted against the pale light from within. It was Daniel, but he looked different. His face no longer vacant, but filled with clarity. His eyes were dark, but there was a faint glimmer of recognition in them. "Daniel," Maggie called, her voice shaking. He turned to face her, and for the first time since she had arrived at Blackrock, she saw him truly. He wasn't the man he had been when she first saw him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair was disheveled, as if he had been through something far worse than any storm. "Maggie," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "It's over." She stepped closer, unsure whether to approach or turn and run. "What do you mean? You were taken by the lighthouse. You were a prisoner." Daniel gave a small, bitter laugh. "I was, but I'm free now. The curse doesn't bind me anymore. I've taken my place. I'm the keeper now." Her heart sank. "You mean, you're the new keeper?" Daniel nodded slowly, but his expression was no longer filled with fear or despair. It was a look of acceptance, even peace. "The light called to me," he said softly. I couldn't leave. None of us can. The lighthouse. It always needs someone to keep it alive, to keep it from devouring everything. Maggie's mind raced. But I don't understand. What happens now? What's going to happen to me? Daniel's gaze softened, but there was a sadness in his eyes. I don't know, but you've seen the truth now. You'll never be able to leave this place, Maggie. You can't walk away from the lighthouse. You're tied to it now, just like I am. The wind howled again, and the ground beneath them trembled. Maggie felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. The curse, the keeper, the light. Everything she had learned was true, and now she was part of it. I'm sorry, Daniel said quietly, but this is your fate. You'll be the next keeper. The storm began to rage once more, and Maggie looked up at the lighthouse. The beam of light flickered on again, brighter than ever before, casting long shadows over the landscape. There was no escape, no way to break free, and as the darkness of the storm closed in around her, Maggie felt her body growing heavier, the light from the lantern room drawing her toward it. Maggie could feel the weight of the lighthouse's presence pressing in on her, the pull of the light growing stronger with each passing second. She wanted to fight it, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. It felt as though the light had wrapped its tendrils around her, tightening its grip, pulling her toward the very heart of the curse. Daniel stepped forward, his face expressionless, though his eyes held a hint of sympathy. Maggie, you've been given a choice, just as I was. The light will claim you, just as it claimed me. It's a part of us now, a part of this place. Maggie shook her head, struggling to move, but it was as though the very air around her had thickened, her movements sluggish, heavy. No, I can't. I won't. There must be another way. You know there isn't, Daniel replied quietly. I tried to fight it. I tried to escape. But the light, it doesn't let you go. Not once it's chosen you. A cold, suffocating silence hung between them, broken only by the distant crashing of waves against the rocks. The lighthouse towered above them, looming like a watchful predator, the beam of light sweeping over the ocean in a slow, deliberate arc. Maggie could feel it pulling at her, beckoning her to step inside. You don't have to do this, she said, a tear escaping her eye. You were a person once. You had a life outside of this place. You were free. Daniel's eyes darkened, the emptiness creeping back into his gaze. I had a life, yes, but that was before I became the keeper, before I heard the call of the light. And now, he trailed off as if the words no longer had meaning. Maggie's heart ached for him. She wanted to scream, to lash out at the cruel fate that had befallen him, that had consumed him, body and soul. But in her chest, she felt the same cold dread stirring. It was no longer a matter of if the lighthouse would take her. It was already happening. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the bell tolled once again. Louder this time, as though it were calling to something deeper than just the keepers. Maggie stumbled, unable to find her footing as the sound reverberated in her bones. The walls of the lighthouse loomed closer, and with each breath, the air grew heavier, suffocating. I don't want this, Maggie whispered, tears blurring her vision. I don't want to be the next keeper. I want to go home. I want to forget all of this. Daniel's gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, it was as if the curse lifted just enough for him to remember who he once was. You can't forget, Maggie. No one ever forgets the lighthouse. It's always with you, changes you, takes pieces of you until you're no longer who you were. You become the light, and the light becomes you. With a final, mournful look, Daniel stepped aside, his body dissipating into the shadows of the lighthouse. Maggie, heart pounding, took one last look at the towering structure. She could hear the whisper of the wind through the cracks of the lighthouse, the sound like 1,000 voices calling her name, beckoning her to enter. Maggie stood frozen, staring at the entrance to the lighthouse, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She could feel the weight of the curse pulling at her, drawing her closer, but she still fought it with every ounce of her being. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door, but she hesitated. The thought of becoming another keeper, of succumbing to the endless cycle of the lighthouse, filled her with a sickening dread. But there was no escaping it now. She had crossed the threshold, and there was no going back. "Maggie?" A voice echoed from the shadows, and she spun around, heart leaping in her chest. It was Daniel again, or rather, a ghost of him, a fading echo of the man he had once been. "There is no escape from the lighthouse. It's a part of you now." Maggie swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I don't want it to be. I want to fight it. There has to be a way." "You can fight," Daniel said softly. "But know this, the lighthouse feeds on the fear of its keepers. The more you struggle, the more it claims you. The more it changes you. There's only one way out." Maggie's breath caught. "What do you mean? What way out?" Daniel's form flickered once again, his figure growing more translucent by the second. "The only way to truly break free from the lighthouse is to become the light itself." Maggie's eyes widened, disbelief flooding her. "What? You mean, give myself up? Become a part of it?" Daniel's ghost nodded, his face somber. "You'll have to leave behind everything you were. But it's the only way. The light will claim you, but if you become one with it, it will stop taking others. The curse will end. The lighthouse will finally go silent." Maggie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The idea of becoming part of the lighthouse, of giving up her humanity to stop the curse, felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought for. But she couldn't ignore the desperation clawing at her. She looked back at the lighthouse. The light pulsed, almost as if it were breathing, waiting. The decision was hers. She could step inside, let the light consume her, and end the curse once and for all. Or she could refuse, knowing that the cycle would continue, with more keepers falling into the same trap. "Is there another way?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel's ghost shook his head. "There's no other way, Maggie. You know it in your heart. The lighthouse will take you, or you can choose to become it." Maggie stood there, her mind racing. She could hear the wind howling, the sea crashing against the rocks below. The light beckoned her, calling her to step into its embrace. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her like a blanket. There was no easy answer, no way out of the darkness. The light would claim her one way or another. And so, with a final, heartbreaking glance at the empty town behind her, Maggie stepped toward the lighthouse. Maggie entered the lighthouse, her footsteps slow but resolute. The air inside was thick, heavy with the weight of years of history and sorrow. The light from the lantern room bathed the interior in a harsh, cold glow, casting long shadows across the walls. The bell tolled once more, but this time, it was different. The sound wasn't as oppressive. It wasn't the ominous toll of doom. Instead, it felt like a final exhalation, as if the lighthouse itself were breathing a sigh of relief. Maggie approached the lantern room, where the light flickered and hummed. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the brass handle. The warmth of the lantern seemed to seep into her skin, and she felt a surge of power, of ancient, unknowable force, course through her body. And then it happened. Her body shifted, her essence merging with the light. The world around her dissolved into pure, blinding radiance, and for a moment, she could feel the weight of the entire ocean, the sky, the lighthouse itself. She was no longer Maggie Turner, the journalist who had uncovered the story of Blackrock. She was something else, something eternal. And in that moment, she understood. She understood that the lighthouse was never meant to be escaped. It was a cycle, an endless loop of keepers of light and darkness that stretched beyond time itself. The curse had ended, but a new keeper had taken her place, and the light would shine forever,